Ruthless, calculated, without mercy. The afternoon sun hammered down on the barren yard, and a young woman was stretched between two cottonwood trees, her arms pulled wide by coarse rope. Her clothing was shredded, her skin bore the marks of suffering, and the pale dust had settled over her like a burial shroud. She kept her eyes closed, because opening them meant remembering, and remembering meant she might finally shatter. A man stood before her, perfectly still, his shadow falling cold across the ground at her feet. He wasn't in any hurry. He didn't say a single word. He simply watched. Rosebell forced her cracked lips apart, though her throat felt like gravel and dried blood. "Stop looking," she breathed, the words barely reaching the air. But the man didn't turn away. Instead, he stepped forward, deliberate and unhurried, as though what he was witnessing carried real weight. From where he stood, Elias Boone could see the marks on her wrists weren't new. That one detail told him everything words couldn't. This wasn't the product of a single rage. This wasn't one terrible afternoon. This had been happening repeatedly and with intention. Not punishment, not fury. Something far colder than either of those things. Rose tried to twist her body away, even as the rope bit deeper into her skin, because she could not endure another man's eyes on her this way. Not like an animal staked out in a field. Not like something that belonged to someone else. If he looked too long, he might start to understand. And if he understood, everything she had buried would claw its way back to the surface. Elias didn't look away, not out of cruelty, not out of morbid fascination, just something quiet and heavy, like a man who was finally counting the true cost of something that had been ignored far too long. Then a voice sliced through the heat at his back. Gideon Pike stepped out from the shade of the porch, one hand resting near his Colt, his eyes already carrying something harder than a warning. He said it was a family matter. He said that ought to be more than enough reason for any man to climb back on his horse and ride on. Elias didn't move. Didn't reach for his gun, didn't take a single step backward. For a stretched, brittle moment, it looked like he might do something far more dangerous than simply leaving. Something measured and cold that made Rose's chest tighten more painfully than the rope ever had, because he hadn't backed down. And sometimes, the man who refuses to look away is the one who changes the entire course of things. So the question sat there in the scorching air, plain and brutal all at once. Was Elias Boone about to pull her free? Or was he about to become one more man she would never escape? Elias didn't ride far. He kept his pace easy, like a man with nothing on his mind but the road ahead, but his eyes kept drifting to the dust behind him. Nothing followed. No gunshot cracked the silence. No shout carried across the flats. That was the part that unsettled him. Because men like Gideon Pike didn't forget. They waited until the moment was theirs again. Elias reached the bend near the dry creek bed and pulled his horse to a stop. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty land stretching before him, his jaw set tight, like a man losing an argument with himself. Then he turned the horse around. By the time the sun burned low and red along the horizon, the ranch had gone eerily still. No voices, no movement near the main house. Elias didn't approach through the front. He circled wide, hugging the shadows, moving the way a man moves when he has learned through hard experience that doors are not always where safety lives. He found her in the storage shed behind the barn. The door was barred from the outside. Not carelessly, just with the certainty of someone who wanted no interruptions. Rosebell was slumped against a grain sack, her wrists bound again, her strength wrung nearly dry. Her head barely lifted when the door creaked open. For one terrible second, she was certain it was Gideon. Every muscle in her body seized, even with almost nothing left in reserve. Then she saw who it was. Elias didn't waste words. He knelt beside her, cut the rope clean with one pull of his blade, and held out a canteen. "Easy now," he said quietly. She drank the way a person drinks when they've had no say over anything in a very long time. They didn't linger. Elias helped her upright, half supported her out the back of the shed, and got her settled onto his horse. She winced getting up. She didn't complain once. That told him more than she probably intended. They followed the edge of the Pecos at a steady walk, staying low against the land, keeping quiet. Elias chose every turn with care, like a man who assumed eyes were on him from somewhere he couldn't quite see. After a time, Rose found enough of her voice to speak. He says it's my fault, she said softly. The words came out thin, worn down by repetition. That I can't give him a child. Elias didn't answer immediately. He'd heard that particular story before, more times than he cared to carry, but then she said something that made him look at her differently. I overheard them fighting, she continued. His father said something was wrong with Gideon. Said things no son ought to hear spoken out loud. Elias slowed the horse slightly. Rose swallowed. He said the family still needed an heir. He said if I wouldn't cooperate willingly, they'd find another way to get what they wanted. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. Rose stared down at her trembling hands for a moment, like she resented them for giving her away. Then she pushed forward anyway. Gideon said leaving me tied out there would teach me to respect him, she whispered. But that wasn't the real reason. Her voice nearly gave out underneath the weight of it. It was meant to break me, to make me stop saying no. Elias said nothing. He simply gave her the space to say it at whatever pace she needed. Rose kept her eyes fixed on the failing light ahead. I kept telling myself that if I stayed quiet enough, maybe it would pass. Maybe he'd settle down. Maybe his father would leave things alone. She shook her head once, slowly. But men built that way don't stop when you go silent. That was the moment Elias understood something important about her. She wasn't frightened in the way he had first thought. She was worn through, yes, but not broken. She'd been living inside a trap with no visible exit, and she was still sharp enough and clear-headed enough to name exactly what had been done to her. Out in that country, a person could lose everything before anyone thought to call it wrong, and the moment people started calling something family business, a body could disappear right out in the open while everyone around them found somewhere else to look. Rose turned slightly toward him. If you take me back there, she said, her voice stripped down to its bare truth, I won't survive it. She didn't cry when she said it. That made it land heavier than tears ever could. Elias's grip on the reins tightened just a fraction. He had known cruel men. He had known desperate men. But this was something else entirely. And one thing had become clear to him, settled and certain at the bottom of everything. If he simply rode her out of this territory, it wouldn't be finished. Men like the Pikes didn't release what they believed belonged to them. They came back for it. They always came back, so the real question wasn't how much distance they could put between themselves and that ranch. It was this. How do you stop a man who has decided he owns another human being? The horse slowed on its own, like it sensed trouble before any man's mind could form the thought. Elias didn't need to turn around. He heard it. Hooves coming in fast and direct, Rose went rigid behind him. She didn't ask who was coming. She already knew. Elias steered the horse down toward a low bend near the Pecos where the ground dropped and the brush grew in thick and tangled. Not much in the way of cover. Enough to ruin a clean shot. He stepped down first and then helped Rose to the ground, steady and quick all at once. Stay low, he said. Nothing more than that. The riders crested the rise seconds later. Gideon Pike out front, his face pulled tight with something worse than anger. Behind him, the same large hired man from earlier, already drawing a rifle up from the scabbard. No conversation this time. Gideon spurred forward like he intended to run Elias straight into the ground. Elias didn't go for his gun. Too close. Too unpredictable. Instead, he stepped directly into it. The first blow came in hard. Gideon swung with everything his rage had built up behind it, but Elias read it before it arrived. He turned just enough, let it glance off, and then drove his shoulder forward and knocked the man clean out of the saddle. They hit the earth together in a cloud of dry dust. Gideon came up fast, wilder now, meaner for having gone down once. Elias didn't waste motion. One deflection, one tight punch, a second one that caught the ribs and made Gideon fold just slightly at the middle. Behind them, the hired man leveled his rifle. Rose moved without thinking. She grabbed a chunk of loose stone from the ground and hurled it with whatever reserve she had left. It wasn't much to look at, but it was enough. The man flinched for just a fraction of a second. That was all Elias needed. He closed the gap, drove the rifle barrel wide, and put the man down hard into the mud along the water line. When it was finished, both of the pikemen were breathing rough and going nowhere. Gideon was on his knees spitting dust and something like pure hatred. You think this is where it ends? Gideon rasped. Elias pressed the back of his hand to his split lip and tasted copper. His ribs ached steadily from where a boot had connected earlier. This hadn't come easy. He felt every bit of it now. No, he said simply. It doesn't. And he meant it. Because if they rode on now, Gideon would come again. And next time he wouldn't come in this sloppy and hot-headed. Rose stood a few feet away, still shaking but upright. That mattered more than anything else in that moment. Elias looked at her. Then back at the two men in the dirt. Riding away wasn't going to resolve this. Disappearing wasn't going to resolve it either. This kind of thing didn't stop until someone made a deliberate choice to stop it. And for the first time, Elias Boone stopped calculating how far they could run. He started thinking about ending it for good. He didn't particularly like what that meant, but he liked even less what would happen to Rose Bell if he walked away from it. Elias didn't waste another moment. He got Rose to a small house on the edge of Fort Sumner. It belonged to an older widow who had learned long ago that a man who knocked a certain way deserved the courtesy of no questions. Rose needed sleep. She needed food. She needed a door that stayed shut and stayed locked. Elias didn't stay long. He made sure she was settled, then turned straight back toward the Pike Ranch before the sun had fully dropped from the sky. Some things have to be settled while the trail is still fresh. He came in from the back again. Same approach. Quiet, patient, deliberate. The yard looked abandoned, but Elias had stopped trusting appearances a long time ago. Men like Harlan Pike didn't leave their ugliest business sitting out where anyone could stumble across it. He found what he was looking for in the storage shed, a ledger. Old, worn at the spine, wedged behind grain sacks like it was nothing worth noticing. It was everything worth noticing. Elias turned the pages carefully. Most of it read like ordinary ranch record-keeping at first glance. Feed quantities, tallies, routine figures. Then the pattern began to take shape the way a brand emerges from smoke. Dates that lined up precisely with what Rose had described. Short notations. Written cold. Enough to trace the outline of something deliberate. References to keeping the line intact. Notes about the woman needing to be brought into compliance. Nothing stated plainly. Everything implied clearly. Elias closed the ledger slowly. Now he understood the full architecture of it. Not just cruelty born from temper. Not a man who lost control on bad days. Something organized. Something rotten all the way down to the foundation. By morning, he had the shape of a plan. He didn't go to the sheriff first, not yet. Men like the Pikes needed to be witnessed before they could be judged by anyone. So he went first to the deputy. Said just enough to plant unease and let it grow on its own. Then to the small church on the edge of town, where the preacher had spent months sitting on whispers he hadn't known what to do with. Elias didn't argue with either of them. He didn't beg. He simply said, "Be there." Neither agreed immediately. Men looked at the ground, shifted their weight, but neither one said no outright. The deputy finally spoke, sounding like a man already uncomfortable with his own voice. He said that if it came down to Elias's word against the Pikes, the whole town would fracture down the middle. Elias nodded. He had already accounted for that. The preacher looked like he had aged several years in the past few minutes. He admitted that he had heard enough over the past year to know something was deeply wrong. But he said that hearing a thing and standing in the open when it finally surfaces were two entirely different acts of courage. Neither man sounded bold. That was actually what Elias had been hoping for. Bold men in stories were easy to believe in. Real men were far more complicated. They had families to think about, livelihoods to protect. They worried about what would still be standing once the dust finally settled. One of the ranch hands rubbed the back of his neck and muttered that Pike paid better wages than most outfits in the territory. Then he looked off to the side and quietly added that he had heard Rose crying more than once through the walls. That was the first genuinely honest thing anyone had said all morning. Elias tucked the ledger under his arm. Then come and hear the rest with your own ears. He didn't need anyone to be fearless. He just needed them to be present. Sometimes that was the most a town could offer. Sometimes it turned out to be enough. Then he sent word to Gideon Pike, said Rose was ready to return, said she'd be waiting by the trees. The same trees. Late afternoon when the heat still pressed low and the shadows hadn't fully stretched. They all came. Gideon arrived first, riding in hard, already wearing the expression of a man who believed he had won. Harlan came behind him, slower, colder, his eyes scanning everything with the wariness of a man who had survived this long by reading every room before walking into it. They did not expect to find Elias standing there. They did not expect the deputy, or the preacher, or the two ranch hands who had witnessed too much over too many months and said nothing until now. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Gideon moved. He came straight at Elias, rage doing all his thinking for him the way it always had. The fight this time didn't last. Elias met him head-on. One measured step to the side, one precise strike, and Gideon went back down into the same dust he'd sent Rose down into so many times. Harlan reached for his gun. That was the mistake that finished him. Elias moved faster than a man his age had any right to move. The rifle stock came up and cracked hard against Harlan's forearm. The gun dropped useless to the ground. Silence fell over the yard like something physical. Then Elias did the one thing none of them had anticipated. He dragged both men to those trees, the same trees they had chosen for Rose, and he bound their wrists to the bark with the same rope. Not savagely, not with any performance of cruelty, just firmly and with the absolute finality of something that was finally being set right. Nobody stepped forward to stop him. Nobody called it family business this time. The deputy stared. The preacher stood with his head bowed. Every person in that yard could see, plainly and without the possibility of misreading it, exactly what had been done in that place and by whose hands. Elias stepped back. He looked at the two men tied to the trees. Then he looked at the faces watching. The whole yard had gone completely still. No one had a comfortable word left available to them. Because bringing the truth into the light is one thing. Learning to carry it afterward is something else entirely. The yard stayed quiet for a long time after the dust stopped moving. Nobody rushed forward. Nobody reached for an easy explanation. Because for the first time, every person standing there had seen it with their own eyes. Not rumor, not something passed along in hushed tones and quietly dismissed as somebody else's concern. The truth stood right there in the open air, tied to two trees under the very same sun that had scorched Rose Bell down to almost nothing. The deputy moved first, slow and deliberate but moving. The preacher lowered his head in the way a man does when he finally admits to himself that he should have moved sooner, and Elias Boone did nothing more. That was the part that meant the most. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike again. He didn't position himself as anyone's judge or anyone's savior. He had already done the thing that is hardest to do in open country and in closed towns alike. He refused to look away. Within a few days, the Pike Ranch had gone hollow. Word traveled the way it always does in small places, faster than anyone plans for it. Some people said the law would handle the rest of it. Others simply stopped going near that land. Either way, the Pike name no longer carried the authority it once had. Men stopped hiring on there. People began speaking certain names differently when they came up in conversation, and Rose Bell did something even harder than surviving. She stood back up. Not all in one motion. Not without the occasional tremor running through her. But she stood. She helped repair fencing. She fed horses in the early morning. She slowly and quietly reclaimed the small pieces of a life that had been methodically stripped from her. No declaration. No dramatic turning point. Just steady, quiet strength, one day added to the one before it. Elias watched from a distance at first, then from a little closer. Not as a man who had rescued someone, as a man who was learning what it looks like to stand beside someone who is doing their own hard work of becoming whole again. One evening, as the light fell gold and low across the fence line, he stood next to her looking out over the land. He didn't say much. After a while, he said quietly, "There's not a whole lot out here a man can fix." He let that sit for a moment. "But some things you don't just ride past," Rose didn't answer. She stood there with him, and for the first time in longer than either of them could easily name, that was enough. Out there in that country, that was about as close to peace as a person was likely to find. If you stayed with this story all the way through, I'm grateful for that. These stories are drawn from real human experiences and retold with certain details